like many people, I've been watching some of the Olympics. And obviously, because of the time difference with Tokyo, it's not always possible to watch it live, so you get the highlights. And I've been amazed that they're now giving gold medals for riding BMX bikes. I mean, the whole world's going crazy. But I'm pleased to say I shouldn't complain because we're winning a lot of those medals, so that's good for us. But one of the things I do like to keep an eye on in the Olympics, and this will show you what a sad person I am, is one of the sports that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's the golf. So you probably heard Rory McIlroy missed out on a medal narrowly. And just as I was hearing the news about the golf, I remember thinking, do you know what? I can remember watching live 4 years ago in Rio when the Englishman, whose name escapes me, but the Englishman won the gold medal. And I remember standing in the living room cheering as the winning putt went in. And Tracy was like, what's all this about? Oh, we just won the gold medal in the golf. I thought, wow, I remember that. And I thought, gosh, that was 4 years ago. Only it wasn't. It was 5 years ago. And you're like, where did those 5 years go? They just, where have they gone? They've shot past. And the sermon this morning was partly influenced by that. There are three things that have come together. Three things that have come together to shape the message or provoke me and influence me to preach this message this morning. The first one was that experience of how quickly those years have gone. And only yesterday I heard an interview with a best-selling author, and he spoke about how quickly time goes. He said how a friend of his had said to him, Tony, the next 10 years will disappear in a flash. They'll be gone before you know it. And then he offered this thought, and it just stuck with me. He said, you know, in 5 years' time, you're going to arrive someplace. The question is where? And in 5 years' time, you will be someone. But the question is who? And perhaps the saddest thing would be if in those 5 years, we're still in exactly the same place and we're exactly the same people. Then comes the second stream that's hit me this week, which is that a number of very influential preachers and leaders, particularly in the United States, have had to stand down in the last few months because of various scandals. Even in this country, a well-respected Anglican leader has been found guilty of physical abuse, violence, not just on a one-off, but a repeated history of physical abuse over 20 years. And one of the stories in America, and some of you may have seen the documentary about it, was of a pastor of a very successful, very big church in New York. And it emerged that he effectively had a double life. He was pastoring the church and was married with children and was also conducting a relationship effectively under a different identity with someone else. And for me, one of the most difficult is one of my personal heroes who's been an influence on me, a very influential speaker and writer, had to stand down many years ago from his first church after he was basically accused of bullying, verbally abusing, even physically abusing staff members. He denied it, resigned, moved on, started again. And now, 4 years later, the same allegations are emerging in his new church. And I just found myself asking, why, Lord? I know we're all only human, but at the end of the day, you know, of all the people that ought to stand for something different, it ought to be those of us who claim the name of Jesus. And some of the stories, I know I'm not in any way judging these people, because but for the grace of God go I. But what worries me is how can you get in a position where you are, in some cases, physically beating people? And this goes on year after year after year for decades. And yet you continue to preach the gospel week by week. I can't get that. And then the third stream that kind of came together to make this river was something that David Barnes has been challenging us as leaders about in the last few months. And he's written some papers about it, as you know, in the church newsletter. And I want to summarize what David was saying with just one word: intentional. Intentional. David's challenge is, are we intentional about making disciples? Are we intentional about reaching the lost? Or do we just hope it will happen? And those three streams came together for me in one sort of river of challenge, which is this, that I think for many of us, and I'm not talking primarily about us as a church, I'm talking about us as individuals, as men and women, as spouses, as parents, as Christian believers. It's all too easy to get caught up in the drift of the river, just to get swept along. And we find ourselves 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years down the line and think, how did I get here? Where's that time gone? What happened to those things that I was going to do? And I don't mean, redecorate the house. I mean that, those issues, those challenges in my life that I was going to address. Well, I never got time because there was this and there was that, and there was busy with this and busy with the other, and the river just swept me along. And to go back to where I started, here I am 5 years later. How did I end up in this place, and how did I end up as this person? My reflection on all these stories that I've heard of ministers that have, if you like, gone off the rails would be this: that just going to church, just doing church things, actually does not by itself change us. We can go to church for years and years and years and do all the religious things and do them sincerely and still be the same on the inside. There has to be an intentionality, an intentionness, that we take responsibility, that we're not just going to hope these things happen, but we are going to make decisions about who we are going to be, who we are going to become, and what direction we're going to set for our lives. Now, all of this sounds very, in a sense, unchristian, doesn't it? Where's Jesus in all of this? But actually, as I was reflecting on the Bible and the stories and the messages and the teaching of the Bible, I realized there was something there that we just gloss over, that we just don't see it. It's there on almost every page, but we don't spot it. And so I want to take you through the book of Philippians and just point out, this is one example. I've chosen the book of Philippians because it's so well known, but we could have gone through the Gospels and looked at the teaching of Jesus. We could have looked at some of the great stories from the Old Testament. Let's look at Philippians, a book, as we know, that's all about joy in the Christian life. Yet it starts off with Paul talking about being in prison and the hardship he faces. And yet this is his response. He says in verse 18, I will continue to rejoice. Verse 20, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, I'm sure you've heard over the years some wonderful sermons on that. It's very moving stuff. But then what's his challenge to the Philippians? Verse 27, whatever happens, in light of what I've just told you about my sufferings and my hardships and how I respond, therefore for you, whatever happens to you, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of Christ. And here's the bit that we kind of gloss over. That's a decision that you have to make. Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. That is not something that just happens because you go to house group every week. That is not something that will just happen because you use your daily reading notes on a regular basis. You have to decide as an act of commitment that is how I am going to live. It's a decision. It's an intention. And the book of Philippians is full of these. Chapter 2. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, this is verse 12, sorry, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation. That is something you have to do. God is not going to do that for you. He will help you, because then Paul goes on in the very next line, for it's God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. And we tend to emphasize the second and neglect the first. We tend to emphasize, God is at work within us. Yes, he is. But you can't take the second part without the first. And the first bit is work out your salvation. You have to decide. You have to commit. You have to be intentional. You have to say, I am going to live this Christian life purposefully. And I'm going to make it my business to grow closer to God. I'm going to make it my aim to walk faithfully with Jesus every day and get to know him more. If you want a great picture of this, the picture I would use is in the Old Testament. When Joshua and the people are about to enter the promised land, how do you enter the promised land? There's a problem. There's a sea in front of you. Well, they've had experience with this one before. Back in the days of Moses, wasn't a problem. Moses had his staff. He stood there in front of them, lifted up his staff. God sent the wind and the waves parted and through they went. Only this time it's going to be different. God gives them a different thing to do. He doesn't send Joshua out to the front with the staff. Instead, he commands those that carry the Ark of the Covenant to walk into the river. Everyone else can follow. That's easy for them. They're not going to get wet. The people carrying the ark have to walk into the river with it. Now, I don't know if you've ever imagined this. You're carrying the ark, and every step you take, the river is still there. In fact, we're told, just for good measure, it flows in flood. Now, you would think God would meet us halfway. You take a step forward, the water will come down an inch. You take a step forward, no. Every step they took towards that river, it just kept flowing. Until they took the very last step. The very last step of commitment and faith. For the scripture says, as they stepped into the river. Can you imagine? They had to step into it. God, if you don't do something, not only are we going to get swept away, but the ark is going to go sailing off down the river as well. And it was as they stepped into the water that God parted the waters. And the ark went through on dry land and the people followed. You see, they had to work out their salvation. They had to carry the ark and walk into the river. And it was only when they did that bit that God did his bit. We want it the other way round. You separate the waters and I'll carry the ark through. God says, no, you work it out. You begin to work out what I've put in you. And as you begin to work it out, then you will discover that my power is at work in you and through you to change you. And we could go on. He says, do everything without complaining or arguing. That's a decision. You can't just sit there and go, well, I'll just see what happens. That's deep. You know what happens if you're in default mode? Arguing and complaining are two of the most natural activities. If you're going to not argue, if you're not going to complain, you have to be intentional. You have to decide. And then we could go on into chapter 3 as well. Consider verse 12. Paul's talking about all that he'd given up, his past life, all the honor that he had as a Pharisee, all of that stuff. He says it's rubbish compared to what I have in Jesus. He says in chapter 3, verse 12, and he's talking about pressing on to maturity. Not that I have already obtained all this or have already been made perfect, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead, I press on towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenwards in Christ Jesus. Do you get the language? Straining, pressing on, seeking to take hold. These are all decisions. Paul's saying, I'm not just kind of wandering around day to day hoping these things are going to happen. No, this is the goal of my life. I am intentional about this. I am focused on this. I am committed to this. This is how I'm going to live my life. I am going to pursue Christ deliberately with every ounce of my being. And then he adds, for good measure, all of us who are mature should take such a view of things. Are you mature? Is that how you look at it? Or are you just hoping that, just keep coming to church, doing the religious stuff, and just let life flow along, and hey, maybe one day I'll wake up and I'll be godly. Maybe one day I'll wake up and my heart will have changed. And there are the occasional stories of people that do have these miraculous overnight, not conversions as in being born again, but conversions of the heart, of suddenly becoming radically different people, delivered from drugs and alcohol. But as somebody said to me, for every one of those stories that we love to hear, there are 1,000 other stories of men and women who had to battle for years until they saw the breakthrough, until they saw the victory, until they saw the answer. And they had to set their faces intentionally to walk that journey. Are you intentional about living your life for Christ? Are you intentional about dealing with some of your character flaws? Are you intentional about seeking God for growth in faith, in hope, and in love? Paul elsewhere, I think it is indeed in Philippians, might be a slightly different translation, where he speaks about make it your aim. Make it your aim. Now, I don't know a lot about the military, but I have a fairly good idea how they don't teach them to use rifles. Pick up rifle, fire, fire, over your shoulder, fire. Nobody trains an army like that. There's your target, point, aim, fire. What are you aiming at with your life? What are you aiming at with your Christian walk? Let me encourage you, and I'll work to a conclusion now. Let me encourage you in some of the ways in which, if we are intentional, God will meet us and change us. Over the next 5 years, if you want to grow, if you want to be intentional, these are some of the areas to think about. In fact, I know one chap who says to people, you will be the same person now. In 5 years' time, you will be the same person as you are now, except for these things. The first one is the books you read. The books you read. I'm not just talking about the Bible, although that is a pretty good book to be reading on a regular basis, I have to say. But I'm talking about those books that will stir your heart. Those books that will build your vision. Those books that will deepen your prayer life. Those books that will encourage you and teach you more about the faith. What books are you planning to read in the next 5 years? People say, well, where's Jesus in that? I'll tell you where Jesus is in that. Jesus is waiting to speak to you through the pages of those books. And you want a good place to start? Read some great biographies. Read some biographies of some of the great men and women of the Christian faith. Hear about their struggle. You know, today what bugs me, but you go into like Waterstones and you go to the biography section, and there are people who are writing biographies in their mid-20s because they've been on X Factor. And what really bothers me is that people are daft enough to buy them and read them. These people haven't even begun to live a life yet. They've just had a bit of celebrity. But you go to some of the great saints of the past, men and women who battled with what we battle with. Men and women who battled with depression, who battled with enemies, who battled with people who stabbed them in the back and didn't understand them and rejected them. But they kept going, and in the end, God came through for them, and churches were planted, and mission agencies were started, and clinics were open, and people were saved, and the sick were treated, and lives were changed. But it didn't happen because they spent 6 months doing X Factor and suddenly everything fell at their feet. They fought for years. And our problem is we want it too quickly. We want it too easily. We need to hear the stories about suffering and sacrifice and how that is the stuff that God uses, not just to build his church, but to build his people. Start with some of the great biographies. You'll be the same person in 5 years' time as you are now, except for the books you read. Secondly, except for the people you meet. Except for the people you meet. Can I challenge you to be intentional about meeting challenging people? People who will widen your horizons about what's possible. People who will challenge you to go further than you've ever been before. People who will challenge you about what's possible in prayer or what's possible through service. People who won't just open your eyes to see the need, but challenge you about what you can do to help meet it. One of the things that we ought to be most concerned about is that there is a whole host of research now from sociology and psychology which says that over time, we tend to become like the 5 people we spend most time with. You will tend to pick up their health habits. You will tend to pick up their aspirations. You will tend to pick up their approach to life. And the research on this is quite frightening. When people have looked into it, they've discovered the people that you spend, the 5 people that you would consider your closest group you spend most time to, you will be within a few percentage, by and large, a few percentage points of their salary. You'll be within a few percentage points of their weight and their health style. The people you surround yourself with, they will influence you. So who are you meeting? Now, you might not be able to change your closest circle because you can't just get rid of your family. It doesn't work like that, and God wouldn't want it to work like that. But be intentional about putting yourself in front of people who can challenge and inspire you. Think about the people. In my last church, there was one chap that I made it my business to spend time with him because he was an older gentleman in his 60s. He must be in his 80s now, in his 60s. And I said to him, my goal in life is that when I'm 60 something, I want to be like you. I want to be like you. In terms of his passion for Jesus, in terms of his faith, in terms of the kindness of his heart. Here was a man, who I won't bore you with the story, he had every reason to be angry and bitter, and actually he was one of the most kind-hearted men I'd ever met. Put yourself in front of people who are where you want to be with Jesus. The books you read, the people you meet, the experiences you have. That's the third one, the experiences you have. What are you planning to do? Where are you planning to go to be challenged? You know, we would think nothing of spending a couple of years planning a holiday to Disneyland, or going on a cruise of the Mediterranean, or, you know, whatever it is that rings your bell. We would think nothing of saving and planning and let's go and take that holiday. And yet Ray and Kay could stand here and bear testimony to the people whose lives were changed because they went out with soapbox and they worked in India, or they worked in the Philippines, or they worked in Eastern Europe. And they spent a couple of weeks rubbing shoulders with the poor and the struggling. And they saw what the need was, but they also saw the faith of God's people. People who in many ways had nothing, and yet were doing far more with the gospel than we ever dream of. And men and women have come back from those mission trips changed. Their hearts have been changed. Their minds have been changed. Their passion's been changed. Where are you going to go? Now, I've got a friend. Okay, a friend is pushing it a bit. He probably doesn't even know my name. I have a ministry chap that I have contact with. Let's be more honest about that. And he's always encouraging ministers, if you want your church to change, just take a group of your people and take them to another church. Because when they see and experience something different, they come back and go, well, I'm not sure I'd want to copy that, but we could do things differently here. It's like the story of the dolphin that swims past the two fish and says to them, hi guys, how's the water? And they nod and they swim on, and then one goldfish turns to the other and says, what's water? Because if all you've ever swam in is water, if you've never broken the surface and breathed the air, that's just water. What is water? It's just what is. And if all you've ever known is church as you've known it, if you've never seen anything different, never experienced anything different, then you just think, well, this is the way it's always been and always will be. Where are you going to go to get a bigger vision of God, a bigger vision of what he can do in people's lives? The books you read, the people you meet, the experiences you have, the places you go. Here's the last one, which I'll finish with. How you respond to what happens in your life. That's the biggest one. That's the biggest one. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who was imprisoned by the Nazis in a concentration camp, and he watched as people he loved and knew were exterminated before his very eyes. And yet some survived. And as a psychiatrist, he asked himself, what separated those that survived from those that didn't? And Viktor Frankl, he wrote many books about this, but one of the things he said was this: there are three things that we can bring to life. There's the creative, there's the volitional, and there's the attitudinal. Now, what he meant was the creative is those things that we create, those things that we make happen. We all need creativity in our lives. We all need creative people. The attitudinal is the kind of mental attitude we have, just how we see things. And you would think Frankl would have said that that was the most important, the attitude that you have about things. But he said, no, it's not. The thing that defines those that survived was the volitional, by which he meant that these were the people who said, whatever happens, this is how I'm going to live. Whatever they do to me, these are the principles by which I will live. I will not treat them in response to how they treat me. I will treat them based on who I am and what I believe is right. And he said, and it was those people that survived. And one of the things Frankl taught was, it isn't what happens to you in life that determines your destiny. It's what you decide to do with it. And this is what Paul and the other writers of the New Testament also teach. Because they knew and believed in a sovereign God who was over and behind and under and in everything that happens to us. So Paul can say in Romans 8 that in all things, God is working for our good. Not that everything that happens is good, not that everything that happens we're going to enjoy it, but in all of these things, God is working for our good. Now, just get your head around that for a moment. In the dark things, the ugly things, the unpleasant things, God is still at work for your good, if we will realize it. Because you have to balance that with what the author of Hebrews says. He says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. Folks, as I conclude, can I leave you with this thought? Many of you may be going through the same patterns over and over again and find yourself saying, why does this always happen to me? Why does this keep happening to me? Why do I keep going through this? And the answer is, you are not allowing yourself to be trained. You keep failing the exam. And God will keep putting you through the same course until you learn the lesson, are trained by it, and graduate to the next course. I remember an old minister saying to me, be very careful of the person who claims to have 20 years experience, because they may only have 1 year's experience that they've repeated 20 times. Now you think about the patterns in your own life. And someone else said to me, and I've written this down as a quote, I'll keep it on my desk. It is how we choose to respond in the darkest moments of our lives that will most profoundly shape our character. It's how we choose to respond in the darkest moments of our life that will most profoundly shape our character. The books you read, the people you meet, the places you go and the experiences you have, and the lessons you learn from life, allowing God to train you through the hardships of life. These are the things that will train you. So my question is, where will you be in 5 years' time? Who will you be in 5 years' time? And are you just drifting along the river of life? Or will you be intentional and make pursuing Christ your ultimate aim?